There you go, recording. When we talk about creation and when we talk about, again, what is God doing in these first parts of Genesis? It's God creating order, God creating life from chaos, from disorder, from the kind of the pieces that are there, but a little disheveled. Because we'll see that come up again and again, not just in Genesis, but we'll see it come up in Exodus. We'll see it come up, especially after exile. You'll see it with Jesus and how God takes kind of what's there, because we don't just have nothing in the beginning. What we have is kind of disordered parts that need order. And so what God is able to do and what God does do is simply by just speaking, he's creating order, he's creating life. And then what we see in Genesis 2, again, it's not that there's nothing, but rather God himself gets in the midst of creation. He gets his hands dirty with with pulling from the dust and breathing life into it, getting dirt on his face. And so again, that what we see God doing is creating order or creating life from chaos or disorder. And again, we're going to see that theme come up again, especially when we get to Exodus, which is coming up next week. I know it's quick, and we're going through this pretty quick, but yeah, that's kind of the class. So, um, but yeah, so do kind of get it in our minds already here at 7:50 on a 7:50 a.m. on a Friday, right before the weekend. That over and over and over again, when we talk about the theme of creation, again, God creating life or bringing about order from disorder. And some of you might consider the story later on when you're thinking like something like Ezekiel 37, where God's breathing life into dry bones. Again, it harkens back, or it calls back to these passages where God is breathing life into humanity, creating order or creating life again. That it's not inventing something particularly new as much as it is serving as a reminder of who God is. And so again, that being said, that when we look at here, this kind of infograph there of what you're seeing is with day and night, waters above, land and vegetation, sun to rule, moon to rule, birds to rule the heavens. God's filling it in here at these parts. So again, first 3 days, God is creating the kind of frame. And the next 3 days, next 3 or 4 days, he's filling in that frame of what's now going to fill the sky, what's going to fill the sea, and what's going to fill the land. And then lastly, he's going to create man and woman to rule on his behalf. And you guys take on your quiz of how God's called humanity to be vice regents or co-rulers alongside him with, again, not mastering creation, but ultimately serving and being responsible for creation, which again, especially considering our context and seeing the fires break out, that there's got to be something we can do to do things better to ensure that creation isn't just thrown under our whims and for the sake of either for the sake of gain or for the sake of us just having more or living more comfortably, that we can better care for creation. Because why? Because we're responsible for it. And so we see on that last day that God sets himself up to rule over all creation. So at last, the king, and we talked about this last class, the king sits on his throne, which is what makes Sabbath so significant there, that God takes a day off in order to rest from his labors. And so, are there any questions about that before we move forward?
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
So, one day I was evangelizing in Skid Row, and
Mm-hmm.
someone brought up the point, and then they were trying to point that the Bible was not true. They said, okay, when God created the earth, how is it possible that He created the plants before He created the sun? And so he brought like the whole photosynthesis part of it, and I didn't know how to reply to that. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you had cut out a little bit, but if I'm picking most of it, it's essentially why is Genesis ordered the way it's ordered, because it seems to be out of place. Because You have in other places where God's creating light before he creates the sun. And so there's that other question, is how does God create light apart from the sun? Because all we really know is the sun and other instruments that look like it. And again, and that's why I bring up that Genesis is poetic. That it's not giving us these scientific statements of fact as much as it is trying to tell us about how God creates. And again, he's creating order and how it's moving from God. Like I said before, God creating these frames of God creating the heavens and the earth. He creates the luminaries, he creates light, or he creates light and then creates the luminaries, and then he creates the sun and the moon and the stars. Like, you see this progression of how God is going from building like this. Again, if you think of a house, you don't put furniture on a plot of land and then start building the rest of the house. What you do is that you build the foundation and you start building the frame. And so when we start thinking of that, is that we start thinking something closer to something like temple. And we'll see both here, and it'll come up again in Leviticus, and especially regardless of who you take in Pentateuch. But when you do take Pentateuch, we talk about this more in depth, is that the temple is reflective of the Garden of Eden, that it's God finally together with his people. And so what we're dealing with isn't so much logic, but we're dealing with imagery that the Bible is trying to communicate to us about what is God doing, because plants will fare very, very significantly, especially in the temple when you have trees. And so again, the symbol and the imagery is what the Bible is trying to get at, not so much logical progression. And so when you start seeing that, and when you start seeing how significant, plants first factor in very much into stories, and you can start thinking trees specifically, and even thinking something like a burning bush, where you have vegetation playing a large part. And so I know that was just his example that was being used, but again, you have these symbols that are going to be significant, not just in Genesis, but over the course of the story. Because guess what else happens on a tree? Jesus gets crucified. And so again, that you have this imagery, even in John, and I know I'm getting off the point a little bit, but you have this imagery that what's between these two trees? That you have one guy on one side, another guy on another side. That you have Jesus. And so again, you have to ask what's, again, in between the two trees. And then when you see that in Revelation come up again, you're going to see God together with humanity, and there are a couple trees. And so again, that the imagery that Genesis is trying to get at is going to be brought up again and again in different places. So yeah, to go the logical route, it's not going to make sense, because you'll bash your face against the wall trying to figure out how is light formed before the sun. And so again, and it's not to discount or disclude or to make irrelevant the fact that the Bible is true, but in what ways do we consider it true? That if it has to be scientific, then that's where we're going to find some difficulties. But there's other places where the science is proven. But again, at this point in particular, the point that the Bible is trying to make is how God's filling in creation. So yeah, which most people aren't going to be satisfied by, but that's what's happening. So yeah, very long answer to a short question, but yeah, I needed to give it kind of context so you can kind of see where it's drawn out later on in other places in the Bible. So, all right, any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, well, moving forward. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do this really quickly. So we'll go to move forward, and you guys will see here. Why did it just move that picture around? So again, you have those notes on creation, which might be good. Genesis says it's not chronological because lights are before luminaries, sun, stars, moons. It's poetic, not historic. That it's meant to tell us something about God, which is true. But again, how we conceive in terms of that the Bible isn't just trying to tell us scientific facts. It's not a snippet of National Geographic trying to tell us what's going on. But in fact, it's trying to tell us something theological about God himself. So I said the habitats Days 1, 2, 3 correspond to the inhabitants of days 4, 5, 6. So that you have the frame, then being filled in by those who live in those specific contexts. Again, skies, waters, and earth. And on the second half of sixth day, human beings are created, tasked. And again, I had highlighted this, and I'm going to highlight again. This it says priests and kings of Yahweh, or priestesses and queens of Yahweh. Especially when we get to Genesis 3, this is going to be something that we're going to want to note, especially for what's happening there in Genesis. So again, so keep this in mind, priests and kings of Yahweh, especially in Genesis 3. So, went too far. All right, Genesis 3 through 1 through 7. What I want you guys to do, we'll take a few minutes in breakout groups to look at Genesis 3, 1 through 7. And then asking the question, talking about a neighbor, about the nature of the first sin. What was so wrong about what the humans did? Genesis 3, 1 through 7. What is so wrong about what the humans did? Because again, it eventually gets them kicked out of the garden, but what is so bad about what they did? So again, I'm going to go ahead and send you guys into your breakout groups. I'll go ahead and talk about it. I'll give you guys about like 7 minutes to talk about it, and then we'll get back together. So
well, I think the serpent made it clear that that if they ate from this tree that they would be like God and know both good and evil.
Yeah.
And so, they desire to, to know both good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And they're curious, if they were to eat from the tree. And then they were deceived because the serpent said, you won't die, and it wasn't necessarily like a physical death, but more like
yeah, there's something that changes after that. Something changes because stuff ain't the same after that.
Yeah.
All right, good. Yeah, so playing into some kind of temptation that's there, and then giving into some of that temptation that the serpent is offering.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, good. One
something
more
we oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Something we came up with was it says that when Eve saw that the fruit was good and she saw that it was desirable, that would imply that she didn't see that before, because she's lived in that garden her whole life and she's seen the tree, but her understanding hadn't been opened. And something that for me we'd been talking about in one of my other classes is the concept of value and what gives things value. And so when the serpent said, this is good to eat, this will make you like God, you'll have understanding of what is good and what is evil, that then opened Eve's understanding to the concept of value.
Yeah.
and gave that fruit value, and it was now desirable.
Yeah. But and then this is where you can talk with me here, Kaylin. Is it, you think it's about the fruit, or what about the fruit? Well, it's kind of a leading question, but is what it is, or is it what the fruit has to offer?
Probably more what the fruit has to offer, because God gave Adam and Eve this whole garden full of amazing foods to eat. But when Eve's understanding was skewed and it was tainted by somebody else telling her, like, hey, this is better than what God gave you. You should use this one. That's when she decided to trust somebody other than God.
Yeah. And then there's a whole lot there to unpack too, which we don't necessarily have time for. We do jump into a little bit in Pentateuch, but there's a whole lot there because what you're saying, Keelan, is very, very true, and does highlight an important part in the story, that there's something about the creature's creatureliness, like the human's limitation, that is seen as good. and that overstepping that kind of boundary of did God really say, and then taking upon yourself that there's something about that that isn't good. And so again, that being said, that especially in a day and age when we're freaking Americans, dang it, we should be able to do whatever we want. Like it's my right to do whatever I want. Like maybe that's not so much the case, especially as a Christian, that there are certain limitations that are good for us. Um, that there are certain things that us making the call on whether or not it's good or not isn't necessarily always the best decision, which, um, yeah, I've lived a whole lot of life in 33 years. It's weird to say that, but I had realized yesterday that I had spent, I think, something like a quarter of my life drinking and taking painkillers. Like that was my thing. Um, and I was like, crap, that's a long time. Like that's really sad to have spent so much time doing. Um, and so yeah, that we humans we're not prone to great decisions, and that we have to be taught, not just taught to make good decisions, but what does it mean to live in this new life, because of the fact that we're so this thing that's in us is it's deep, this inability to reckon what's good and what's evil, and how first humans kind of are they fight with that of trying to forge what is it, what the temptation is between the two. So yeah, you bring up a really great point um, with that, Caitlin. But to go up to so from there, there's a few major issues. One of them, which has already been brought up excellently, both by Caitlin and also by Eden, and Ruben, you brought it up as well. That part of the issue is that what the humans fail to do is that they fail to live into their calling, which that's why I brought up that little brought that hint for you guys. I had seen it to be priests or priestesses and kings or queens, that they're supposed to be representative of Yahweh. And that's God's name in the Old Testament. But they're supposed to be God's representatives on earth. And what they end up doing is instead of representing God, sorry, all this dry air and smoke is nuts, my allergies and stuff. But instead of representing God, what they end up doing is at the end of questioning. And they give into not just questioning, it's more the serpent that does that. But not just questioning, but they're trusting, and this goes in line with the kings and queens bit, that what they end up doing is that they end up shirking their responsibilities in order to be subservient to the snake, and then end up giving in to what the snake is therefore telling them to do. Which again, when your boss is telling you to do something and somebody else kind of comes in from the outside to like, boss lady really say that? You know, something's probably going on. But for the first humans, for Adam and Eve, that it's a shirk of responsibilities, that the task they've been given to do, that they fail to do it. And what we could call that is, because again, we could take this kind of royal language, it's rebellion. That's rebellion. And so, and I'm not just talking about like they have a disagreement, they don't agree on certain politics, they don't do certain things the same. It has nothing to do with that. But that God rather had given them a task and the expectation for obedience, which we'll talk about in a few minutes with Noah. The expectation we'll talk about with Noah, and why Noah is so significant in the story, is for the fact that what you have in this first initial episode is a rebellion of God's, essentially God's people against God, shirking responsibilities from what they're called to do, and instead of being obedient both to God and living into their responsibilities or living into their callings, what they do, they decide to go their own way. They did, to use a phrase from Judges, they did what was right in their own eyes. And that'll come up again later on. So you're going to want to keep this in mind as well. So again, a little bit of foreshadowing. But then to also ask the question, who is God? That these are humans that are created to be godlike, that is in God's image, but what they want to do is be like God. And what I mean by that, as it's already been brought up, is that, and you won't see this on your PowerPoint, I just made an update as it was brought up to make it more clear, is that they're wanting to make the call on what is good and what is evil. That the humans are wanting to make the call on what is good and what is evil. again, it goes back to the idea that they're doing what is right in their own eyes. Are there any questions with that? Yeah, usually sometimes it can get pinned as a lack of faith, a lack of trust, which I think it's kind of part of the problem that's at the surface, but underneath that, and what gets taken up more often than not is, again, the continual rebellion, um, which again is a demonstration of unbelief or demonstration of not having faith. And so, that being said, there is some grace in this. There is some grace in this. And I won't ask these questions, but I'll bring this bit up. Is that what you have in the story? Is that even in the context of what's happening here, because you have these humans they're ashamed of the image that they're made in, and how you see that again is in the ways that these humans are uh, failing to live into their vocation, their responsibilities. But first, they don't die. Ruben brought that up. So was the snake telling the truth? Well, kind of, but not really, because it's only because of God's mercy that the humans don't die. And by the way, you'll probably have heard in church or that in Hebrew it's death, but that's not what it means. It doesn't mean spiritual and physical death. What it means is just providing the security to say that you absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, 100% will die should you choose to eat from the fruit of that their tree. So again, it's not two sides of death, but rather it's kind of like when you say really, 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 and you say it like 1,000 times to one of your friends or family member to say like how bad something is really great. It's really, 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 really dumb. It just, again, what you're doing is you're providing emphasis on the surety of the thing that you're describing or the statement that you're making. And that's the same thing going on in Hebrew. Is that assuredly, without a shadow of a doubt, it's going to freaking happen. You absolutely will die. But they don't. And not just that they don't die and get kicked out of the garden, God makes garments for them to cover them up as they are going out. Because mind you, they cover themselves up with fig leaves. God goes and he takes an animal and sadly sacrifices it, which again, sin costs us something. It costs God something. Animals sacrificed. And then God makes loincloths. He covers their shame in order for them to go out of the garden. And so then God expels them from the garden. But the wild thing about that is that, mind you, God goes with them. And where they go is east. And you're going to want to keep track of that as well, that God goes with the humans and goes east. God goes with the humans and goes east. God goes with the humans and they go east. And so those curses are reversed. Eve, who is called the mother of all creation, that childbirth, which is meant to be a blessing, will become life-threatening, as it is for still many women here in the U.S. and around, especially around the world. They don't have access to modern medical technologies and resources that we have here in the U.S. That childbirth is risky, still risky, even with all of our technology here in the U.S. And subservience. That's where you have sexism or patriarchy being introduced, that humanity is meant to be co-rulers, and that's what you have at the beginning with Adam and Eve being co-rulers together. That, yeah, we have Genesis 3 to blame for the kind of tension between human relationships, and that's going to be something to pay attention to. It's not just between men and women, but it's also between men and one another and women and one another, as you'll see that both with Cain and Abel, and you'll see that with Sarah and Hagar. The human relationships start getting real tense. And then Adam. And Adam, by the sweat of his face, is he going to eat bread? Which again, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to eat salty bread or it's going to be a little damp from his sweat. That's gross. But what it means is that Adam is now going to have to live with a kind of anxiety about whether his work will be enough. That Adam is going to have to live with an anxiety, wondering if his work will be enough. And speaking now as a married man for almost 2 years, that anxiety is too real. As I'm sure you don't even have to be married to live with that kind of anxiety. wondering whether your work is going to be enough, whether it be schoolwork, whether it be the work you're doing at church or at home, whether or not your job's going to be enough, whether or not you're going to have enough to pay bills, you're going to have enough to pay tuition, whether you're not going to have books. It is too real how deep this anxiety is for all of us. But again, it's a product of Genesis 3 and what's happening there. The kind of anxiety that goes about whether or not our work will be enough for us, which is what makes Sabbath so ridiculously countercultural and almost foolish. That we already live with an anxiety about whether or not we're going to have enough, but at the same time, we're going to take a day off in order to say and to remind ourselves that God is God and we are not. God is provider and we are not. God is Lord and we are not. God is in control and we're not. Yeah, we're responsible. We're going to work hard. We're going to do what we have to do, but at the same time, trusting that it's ultimately God who provides and God is in control and not us. And so the earth starts to get uncreated. And so you have that image of God remaining. They're still representatives of God, but they still retain their calling as God's stewards, but something's changed in the relationship again with rebellion, that there's something that needs to happen, a change of course. And because of that, wrong choices are going to create tension in relationships. Again, you see that with kings and priests, that what ends up being a calling, that be fruitful and multiply, ends up kill or be killed, and that for priests, instead of representing the image of God, we will be tempted to kill it in others. That this inability, we limit the ability of people to want to live out their vocation of being God's stewards in the world. And you often see this happening through colonialism, you'll see this happen through slavery. Racism does this. Again, that makes humans something less than God's representatives on the earth. And so as we move over from Genesis 3 and 4, I won't go too far into Cain and Abel. Again, we go through that in Pentateuch. But prior to Genesis 6, and we'll talk about the flood here, is that violence is the only sin mentioned before the flood. And you have that in Genesis 6:11, and you have this graphic story of violence with Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, which you guys have read. And so, again, I won't go too much into detail about this, but you have the reoccurring theme of what happens in Genesis 3 now kind of slowly starting to spread, because you see it from Adam and Eve. You see how the implications of rebellion introduce tension between family relationships in Cain and Abel. And now you're going to see it full blown in Genesis 6, where now all humanity, which again, violence, again, the tension between relationships, which is often the reason for violence, now starts increasing all over the earth. And so what I want you guys to do, send you guys back into breakout groups here, is looking at Noah's story. Well, let me go ahead and share this again with you guys. Looking at Noah's story, and utilizing your scripture story assignment number 1, answer the following question. What makes Noah's story so significant in light of the preceding stories? Let me go ahead and close that up. In light of the preceding stories, which is, again, creation narratives, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, humanity going more corrupt with violence. What makes Noah's story so significant? So take a look at your scripture story assignment number 1, and then answer the question, and then we'll get back together. I'll give you guys about, another 7 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and we'll talk about it. Let me go ahead and stop sharing this. And so again, I'll go ahead and send the question again. Oh, sorry about that.